obviously you guys went to the Women's March, and I just want to start off with, what does feminism really mean to you guys, particularly, like individually to you guys?
So obviously there's a general definition of equality between the two sexes, but for me it goes a little bit deeper than that. Feminism has been a cornerstone of my entire life. As a woman, I have experienced like sexism like in professional and personal settings, but I want to dedicate my life to feminism, and especially like international feminism. One of my goals in life is going overseas and working with women who experience oppression because of their gender identity overseas in third world countries, as well as develop it here. So I guess like for me, feminism is kind of what makes my life. It kind of what keeps me going, and not only is it to help women move forward in society, but it's also to break down gender norms such as hypermasculinity for men.
So it goes past, for you at least, it goes past more of a political movement into more of a, this is how, like, I'm going to guide my life, and I'm going to, all right?
Yeah.
And then for you?
Well, I mean, I guess I've been lucky enough to not experience firsthand, like, sexist discrimination or anything. But that doesn't mean that I shouldn't stand up for what is right, you know? Like, if you're not a feminist, literally why? All it means is just equality. It doesn't mean that women hate men or that we're better than men or anything like that. It just means equality for all people. And so I don't understand why people wouldn't back that, I guess. Like, I truly don't understand when people say like, oh, I'm not a feminist. Why?
I kind of want to ask them that. Obviously, there are people, like, there are celebrities that won't call themselves feminists because of, like, what they think it means. Do you think that, like, feminism has a bit of, like, a image issue where it comes to, like, people, like, obviously it's about equality, but, like, people see it as, like, they see, obviously, like, probably the radicalized version of it where...
Yeah, exactly.
They perceive it as at least man-hating, whatever. So, do you think that it does have an image problem, and if that's the case, do you like see a way of dealing with that that's not like simply like continuing this like vein of, oh, let's just educate them on what it actually is, bare bones?
Well, I think there's definitely an image issue because people are like, oh, you're a feminazi, which is a whole different topic, but people are like, oh yeah, you just hate men and blah, blah. But like, I don't know what else you can do besides just educate people and tell them, like, no, this is what it is, and you need to lead by example. You need to show them that we're not fighting for more inequality and saying that women hate men or we're better than them or anything. We're just fighting for overall equality, like wage gap diminishing, and, you know, like, just diminished workplace discrimination, and just tiny things that other people take for granted every day that women don't have the luxury of receiving a lot of times. And so I don't know what else we can do besides just educate.
You can add into that at any time.
Sure. So I've actually studied this, and I think something that we need to recognize is that every social movement ever has always had an image problem. Even when the women's right movement started back in the 1800s or even earlier than that, people thought they were man-hating because they wanted more rights. So I think it's important to like recognize that this isn't a new thing. People thinking that misandry and feminism are synonymous has been a thing that's been around for a while. But I think recently it's become bigger because the gap between men and women is closing. It's easier to not recognize the blatant differences between men and women unless you are a woman who's experiencing that direct oppression. So one of the solutions that I think is really important is changing our rhetoric when we talk about feminism, specifically on how we talk about women and how we talk about the movement itself. Right now, I think this might be a fault of some women. Some of the rhetoric comes off as a women's only club when it's very much not so. And that might not be the intention of women who are in the feminist movement but it comes off that way, and that's just subconscious rhetoric that comes out. But we need to become more conscious of our discourse. We need to become more conscious of our rhetoric. On top of that, I think social leaders really need to make this movement to understanding and like reading literature, not only from feminists who have been feminists for a long time, but Black feminists and intersectional feminists and women, feminists. Right, and like women who identify as very many different things. Because I think at this point there is some divide in the feminist movement that has caused some of this image problems.
Yeah, and I think also what people don't necessarily understand is that like we're also trying to diminish the like societal expectations of men too. Like you guys, like you specifically, like men are supposed to be super tough and we don't cry and lumberjacks and hypermasculinity. And so we're just trying to break down the barriers that society has set for mainly gender, I guess, for just so long. We're just trying to break that down and say you can be who you want to be. It's not just about women are awesome, because we are, obviously, but it's not just about that. And I think that's a lot of the division too, is people think we're just fighting for women, but we're not. I
think probably a lot of it comes from I feel like at least the corner, again, I'm not as educated as it could be, but I feel like a lot of the cornerstone of feminism comes from the idea of like smashing the patriarchy, at least.
Right. Yeah.
So obviously to the outside viewer, that probably they probably see that as, well, if there's not people will probably look at that and be like, well, there's not a patriarchy here, so you're obviously just hating on men, because that's the only other discourse they have. So I think most of it comes from the way that they just view the argument differently from the outset. So,
well, like, to that I say, think of a doctor. What's your immediate image of this doctor? Are they a girl or a guy? Just the immediate
For
thing.
me, it's a guy.
It's a guy, right? Just because that's what we've been taught. Or like a scientist, probably a guy in a lab coat. Or what else? Mathematician, again, probably a guy. We're just taught from a very early age that science and math and all of these things is not a woman's place. It just is. We're just encouraged to be more into reading and more into writing and things like that. And so, especially when you look into politics, when you think of a president or a politician, immediately what you think of is probably this well-dressed guy. Like, it's really difficult for people to break down and say, oh, well, a woman can do this too. And I think that's where a lot of people get defensive in the patriarchy, is they don't realize that women are told so often, maybe not directly, but they're told in the way that we go about things that we cannot do these things. And so when people say, oh, the patriarchy doesn't exist, just what you think of automatically should prove to you that the patriarchy does exist, because we just have these automatic assumptions that people in higher power positions are probably male.
And I think at that point, it's also important to recognize that when we do talk about people in privilege not recognizing, let's say, the patriarchy, that's something that affects us, all of us as human beings. I know personally for me, unless I'm educated on a subject about, let's say, like Black feminism or like a minority that is not specifically me, I don't know how it feels like. Even at hypermasculinity, I really don't know. I cannot empathize.
Exactly, because I've never experienced
it.
Yeah.
So I can definitely understand why some people don't understand that the patriarchy exists, because it's when you're in a position of privilege, when you're brought down to equality, it feels like oppression.
I just wish that people who don't understand it would say, I truly don't understand this, could you tell me about this? Instead of saying, oh, it just doesn't exist. Like, instead of dispelling it.
I think that comes back to the rhetoric and discourse issue that we're seeing in the feminist movement today. It feels like in some parts that we've kind of pitted each other up against each other, and it's definitely not, but the image that the media has portrayed, and I think the media becomes a really, really big player in the entire movement. They've made it seem like feminism is kind of like, ooh, join the movement, we don't expect you to like know anything, but join the movement. Mm-hmm. And I really want people to understand that like it's important to ask questions, it's important to start a positive discourse rather than a negative discourse.
We don't fight against, we fight for.
Yes.
We fight for women's equality.
Kind of wanted, you brought it up, the whole kind of like joining the club without really knowing what you're doing. Right. I feel like at least for me, I think that's the issue with a lot of movements, is that like it's an open club that like anyone can define what it means.
Yeah.
So the issue is anyone can define what feminism means at that point because they're allowed in.
Right.
So I guess, do you think that I guess not the definition of feminism has changed, but do you think that not requirements, but like the sort of things that you need to hold true about feminism, do you think they need to be more concrete? Do you think they need to be more...
See, I struggle with that because I'm a really big proponent of having individuality within our feminism. I know my feminism is very different than a Black feminist and LGBTQ feminist, just because we experience different things and our priorities are different. But I think like a way to solve that issue that like, I want to say divide. I'm not sure if that's the right, like...
For lack of a better word.
Yeah,
divide,
for lack of a better word. Divide in the feminist movement, especially when other people are joining it, is becoming more educated. There's a lot of feminist lit out there, and there's a lot of just material to educate yourself on. And if nothing else, the leaders of the movement know indefinitely more than anyone else will. So I think it's about, again, asking questions, but also like taking the time on your own to sit down and maybe read like a paper by like a revered feminist writer, trying to understand the actual issues that matter to you, because obviously as human beings, all different issues matter to all of us.
Yeah.
And that's kind of like how the root of feminism became that sexism was an issue that mattered to all of us. But within sexism, there's a lot of sub-problems.
Yeah, definitely.
And I think with that, I don't think we should be putting one big label on feminism. I think the equality between sexes should be like a general umbrella term, that everything that falls within feminism must fit underneath that in some way. But I think at the end of the day, I think there should be some individuality when it comes down to it.
Yeah. And like all I specifically am asking for is just for people to try to understand what we're fighting for. Because like when people say, oh, I don't experience this, so it doesn't affect me. It does. It affects everybody. And so for people that haven't necessarily experienced discrimination, just to try to understand is so helpful, and says like, oh, I'm here for you. I don't know what this feels like, but I'm here. And I think that's what a lot of feminism stands for too. Because, for example, white straight males, right? People get really defensive when people talk about this, because they're like, oh, we don't have any privilege at all, like blah, blah, blah. It's not your guys' fault. It just, truly, it just is that you guys have the most privilege of anyone on earth. It's just a fact.
Just like Addie and I have more privilege than a Black woman. And it's
Exactly.
not like we asked for that privilege, but we got it.
And all we're asking for is just people to try to understand how scary it is to walk home alone as a woman, that maybe men don't necessarily have to deal with. Again, I don't know, because I'm not in your shoes. But for me, I'm terrified to walk anywhere alone, let alone at night, especially maybe downtown or something that I don't really know the area. But for someone like my brother, he would probably be fine. He could go up to a stranger and ask, hey, do you have any directions? But I would have to walk quickly. I'd have to hold my keys in between my fingers. And it's just so terrifying. And so for people to just say, I don't understand this, could you talk to me about it? Could you help me try to understand, would just be so helpful. You don't necessarily even have to be part of the movement. You don't have to go to protests.
Right.
Just to understand and say, I understand what you're going through, or I'm gonna try to at least, is so helpful.
And I think at that point, I really like the privilege point that you brought up, because I think there's a lot to be said about privilege, and how people will use it.
Yeah.
There's different ways to use your privilege. Like I said, I have more privilege than most, just simply because of the fact that I'm white, right? And I think at that point, we need to start a conversation about how people need to start using their position of privilege to be a voice for others. Something that I've noticed lately is that it means so much more, and this makes me so mad, but it means so much more when a male celebrity comes out as a feminist rather than a female.
Yeah.
And Emma Watson kind of touched on this in her He for She speech, that none of us really wish it would be this way, but it is.
Yeah, it just can't change
and
it.
as men, I think men are in a unique position to come out and convince their other male members that, hey guys, this is not a woman, like a man-hating group. This is literally just equality.
Exactly.
And at that point, I think that's an important note to make for all of us, is that we need to take a second and recognize our privilege and understand that there are productive ways that we can use it. And then we also need to understand that sometimes there's some battles that we can't fight. Something that annoys me to no end is when a male feminist who has very good intentions wants to lead the movement, which can be very harmful, just because it's, at times, it's really not their movement to lead. Because
like,
it's
great
not
intentions, fantastic,
right.
but like
it's not their issues. And sometimes I think, as a point of privilege, I think sometimes you just need to check yourself and take a step back and be an ally, be a number in the body. You don't have to be front and center in the fight for the equality, but you can be a vocal ally.
Yeah, that's
right?
like me trying to lead like an LGBT
or like a Black Lives Matter.
Yeah, exactly. Like
I would
love to help, and I would love to do anything I can, but like, don't try to take the power away from them.
Just
like,
because it's not
still
our
their
issue.
movement. Exactly. So.
I think, at least this is my view. I think what people view I feel like a lot of the defensiveness from privilege, of it, the idea that doesn't exist, comes from mostly from the fact that it kind of makes this victim oppressor kind of dichotomy, because what happens is it basically, for me, that my main issue with it is that it creates this dichotomy where the victim is only redeemable through the fact that they're the victim, that they're through the fact of their oppression, rather than actually building up that individual themselves. So
you're saying that when people tell you that you have privilege, you feel more like an oppressor?
What I'm saying, it's basically say when a woman says say a guy says I don't have any privilege, or someone says they have privilege, it basically says that to that man the only way that this woman is redeemed is through the fact that she's oppressed, rather than that woman making, I guess, not ways for herself, but dealing with that so-called oppression or that victimization, and building through it.
Well, the issue is that that's what we're trying to do, is to
break down
to break down those barriers and to build ourselves up. But it's so difficult because it's just always been this way, that society just has this stigma against strong women, and against privilege too. Like Tara was talking about, men just get more credit for being feminists, because it's like, oh, they don't understand, that's awesome that they're trying to understand, and it totally is. But what the issue is that women have been trying for ages to be able to have the same stigma and privileges that other people have, but we've not been able to, and that's what this whole movement
and I think it's
partially
important
about.
to recognize what privilege is. It's not that women can't endure the obstacles that we're thrown at.
Exactly.
It's just that it's 10 times harder for us than the next white man, right? Let's take, for example, being a CEO of a company. For sure, there are female CEOs everywhere, but I can bet you almost all the money that I had that it was 10 times harder for them to get that position than their male coworker.
Yeah.
I can attest to this in just organizations that I'm in with legislators specifically, where I've had to fight for my voice to be heard when one of my white male counterparts are next to me, because they just value his opinion more. And it's not that it's any fault of my white male counterpart. It's just that it's easier for him. And I think at that point, I think there needs to be some clarification on what privilege is, and it's not a bad thing.
Yeah, and so,
it's a society. No, you're fine. It's a societal construct that is definitely harmful, but it doesn't label someone as a bad person.
Yeah.
And I think everybody has privilege of some sort at some point, and all that means is that you just don't understand how hard it could be for the next person. And at that point, I think I can definitely see where you're coming from, that the discourse of how we use privilege in day-to-day conversation, and especially on a media level can definitely hurt the movement in terms of people thinking that privilege is a direct attack on their personality and their personhood. But I think that's something that can only be fixed through education about what privilege is exactly.
And contrary-wise to your example, like when it's hard for you in politics, I really want to go into teaching, and teaching has just always been viewed as a female occupation, right? There aren't as many male teachers, especially in the elementary age, as there are female. And so for what would be an easier job for me to obtain would be more difficult for a male, just because society just tells them like, oh, you need to go be a cop or something instead of a teacher, you know? And so it's not just about the female struggle, it's also about the male struggle trying to break out of the social constraints that they've had pushed on them for so long. And so I think that's another side of feminism that people don't always see or don't always try necessarily to look at, because they just assume that it's only for females.
And I just want to ask this really quickly, because you do bring up the whole white straight male thing.
Yeah.
I obviously most people are made with good intentions, but obviously the road to hell is paved with good intentions.
Yeah.
So I guess this is just my idea of it. I think that there's that small sect that is constantly just saying you're a racist, you're a sexist, you're homophobic, you're a xenophobe.
That's terrible.
I know.
That's not what we're about.
I know.
Exactly.
And I think the issue with that was it's kind of, for me, is what built up the vacuum that is Trump, for me at least, because when you have these people saying to basically like half the population, you're a sexist, you're a homophobic, you're a racist, one day they're just going to snap and say, all right, I am.
Yeah, exactly. If you tell people what they ought to be for so long, then eventually they'll believe it, which is another thing that falls into feminism. If you keep telling a woman you're not as strong or you need to be this way, we're just going to be that way. And same with men. If you tell them you can't cry, you need to be strong and tough all the time, then they're just going to be that way. And I think especially when it comes to politics, if you tell people, oh, well, you're a racist because you voted for this person. I'm not going to bring in personal beliefs because I'm going to get real heated. But if you continually tell someone you're a sexist, you're a racist, they're going to be that way indefinitely. And so what we're trying to do, I guess, in my opinion, is say, look, you're free to believe what you want as long as it's not hurting anybody, because all we're asking for is equality. We're not asking for more rights, or I mean we are, but like more rights than other people. We're not asking for more freedom than other people. We just want equality, and to not label things is, I think, a really helpful step.
I think with that, like my view on it was, again, a lot of these people are good intention. I don't know if it's like 2%. I don't know if it's 2% of the group that's poisoning the other 48, but I think a lot of it is people seeing the radical, like say 2% going on, and then like there's not a lot of condemnation that they're seeing from the other 48%. So
I think
it's a lot.
I think that's a lot of normalization at that point.
Yeah.
I think I completely agree that I think that like the radical, at some point I wouldn't even call them feminists. I call them misandrists, because that's what they are. That's what they want. Is they want to be better than men, which is what misandry is, and that's a very small population.
That's not what we stand
But they're
for.
also very vocal, which is an issue. I think they definitely spurred the Trump vacuum, but I think a lot of where the Trump vacuum grew is from the normalization from the media being like, oh, this is just normal, this is just another day. Or I know white women were a pretty big demographic that voted for Trump, is white women saying, oh, this is okay. And I think
because it was normalized.
Yeah, it was normalized not only by our world leaders, but by our media, by everybody around us. And that kind of sends a message to these people that it's okay if you have these thoughts. And I was always taught when I was little that like the first thought that comes to your head is what society taught you. But like the second one that like you're like, oh, well, that was not a great thing for me to think of. This is what I actually believe in, is the person you're trying to be. And I think at this point, people are just following what society has told them to be. I know I struggle with that, especially with minorities that I don't aren't like I'm not super familiar with, like people who are genderqueer or intersex. I just don't understand that struggle. So sometimes when I hear things about them, I don't think great thoughts, but the second thought that comes into my head,
like, oh, why did I think that?
Why did I think that? This is what I actually believe.
Yeah.
And I think that comes from a matter of just a level of self-awareness, and being kind of independent from the media and social leaders, understanding when it's okay to speak out and be like, this is not normal.
Yeah, so like, just think again, like your immediate thought isn't always right. Like people tell you to go with your gut opinion, but that's not always your immediate thought, you know?
Well, I think the issue people have with at least that statement is that they see it as like thought policing. They see it as like, well, obviously they're trying to re-educate you, which they're obviously against because that's their way of life. So they don't want to second doubt themselves because that's just how they've been raised.
Yeah, and change is hard. I totally get it. I hate change. I despise it. I like everything to be this way and it has to stay that way, and I don't want anything to change. And so I totally get where people are coming from when they say, well, you're changing my way of life. I totally understand. But the issue comes when they refuse to accept that things are changing, that the world is not the same as it was in 1940, for example. Like, there are just things that need to change, and women's rights is one of them, absolutely. And so I know that it's difficult, but they need to at least try to say, why is this changing? Why is this different? Is there something that I'm missing? Because I'm not saying that you need to think a certain way, just try to understand where people are coming from and ask why these things need to be changed. Why are they feeling that this needs to be different?
And off the top that we've seen, I think it's important to recognize that we're not saying that like the person you are is bad, but we're saying that there are definitely things that society has ingrained in you that are not correct. And that comes from the status quo that you grew up in. Like, I know the status quo that my parents grew up in is very different from the one that we're being raised in right now. And it's all about, like Addie said, adapting to what's the new norm, or maybe not even adapting to the norm, but pushing for better. Because there can't be a new norm unless there's people who are sitting here and saying this isn't okay. If people didn't challenge what our status, like our society was, we wouldn't have nearly like any rights that are equal. Like we wouldn't have the civil rights movement, we wouldn't have the women's rights movement, LGBTQ rights wouldn't even be existent. And I think it's all about breaking away from what we think society wants us to be and gaining our own autonomous decisions to do what we want, in a sense.
And I think relating to the civil rights movement, for example, like when people first started to stand up and say, this is not okay, we need to change this, everyone was like, what's going on, this is not okay. And then now, when we look back in history books, we're like, oh my gosh, I can't believe people actually treated other human beings that way. And I hope that someday people will look back on the women's rights movement and say, I can't believe we didn't treat women as equally.
I think it's also important to recognize that we're not just fighting for women in the United States or Western culture. We're fighting for women
all over,
everywhere.
People who have genital mutilation, people who can't show anything but their eyes.
And
like,
if people are sitting here and thinking that what happened in the 1800s to U.S. women was really bad, they should understand that what's happening to women in like rural Africa or like,
and you can't necessarily compare those two,
right?
Because they're just completely
and that's a really big thing that I have an issue with, because people's argument to feminism is but I think it's important to bring up, because a really big argument to feminism is, well, a lot of people have it worse off than you. I really hate that argument for like three big reasons.
Someone will always have it worse than you, but that doesn't mean we can't fight for what we do.
Right, and it's like, it's not that we're not fighting for them, because we are. Two, at that point, you're basically saying that, like, in the 1800s, women in southern rural Africa still had it pretty worse off than we did, but we still fought for women's rights, and like, I think we can all agree that a woman should have the right to vote, right? Like, I feel like that's not like being argued against.
We're not disputing the fact that, of course, people have it worse than we do. We are super privileged in America, but that doesn't mean that we still don't feel oppressed, that we aren't also fighting for those people that we don't necessarily have access to. Because, like, a woman in Saudi Arabia is still a woman, and that's who we're fighting for. We're fighting for equality of everyone, not just America, not just England, not just Canada. You know, we're fighting for everybody.
Do you believe that, like, obviously the waters get muddy when you do invite everyone into the movement? Obviously, there are sects of feminism where there are sex positive, sex negative, body positive, all that. Do you think that there's obviously coming of infighting from that? Do you think that there has to come a point where you guys all need, like, there needs to come a point where there needs to be, like, buckling down? This is what we're for.
Yes.
Like, as like, because obviously change comes in waves. It doesn't happen all at once.
Course.
So do you think that there are certain things that need to come before other beliefs?
So
I think yes, but I'm hesitant to say yes.
So this is one of my biggest things that I've studied before. Feminism is currently in its what we call the third wave. And the third wave is a lot about intersectionality. What we need to remember is that, like, the feminism that we're familiar with, like, we're like, since the 1800s, this has been very strictly white feminism. It's been fighting for white women's rights. The Women's March back in when the suffrage movement was happening, they put black women in the back. Because their voices weren't important. Black women and Hispanic women make even less money to the dollar than a white woman does.
Exactly.
What we're seeing is this new wave is a lot about intersectionality and understanding that, yes, us white women, like, are being disenfranchised. We don't have, we're being oppressed in some ways, but we also need to recognize that black women and Hispanic women are even farther behind than we are, and that we need to use our unique privilege and sometimes take a step back from the feminist movement and let them lead, just because they are in more need. So I think at some point, yes, we do really need to sit down and we need to say, this isn't just a white women's only club. This is, like, an everybody's club, and we need to recognize our differences. Something that for a while, I was like, I want to live in a colorblind society, right?
It's not possible.
But that middle school me was a whole different story.
I wish it was.
I think at this, but intersectional feminism is all about recognizing our differences and understanding and reconciling the fact that our fights are very different, but our fights are with each other. Not like fighting with each other, but our fights are in unity with each other.
Like, I'm hesitant to say that your fight is my fight, because it's not the same for everybody. Like, each person that was at the Women's March, for example, had a different thing that they were there for, but they were all coming together to march for a specific purpose, but each purpose may have been slightly different for each woman. So I think that the fact that we have a general umbrella thing is really good, but that doesn't mean that everyone fighting for it doesn't mean the same thing to everybody.
Right.
And I don't think that we necessarily should tell everyone this is what you have to believe to be in this movement.
Yeah.
Because, again, I don't want to be a thought police or anything. Like, I want people to fight for what they believe in, but also build others up as they do so.
I think we definitely do need, like, a basic, look, guys, like, if you want to be part of the feminist movement, you need to understand that this is equality between the sexes, and that you can be racist or homophobic, like, just in, like, ground things, because like, obviously you don't want that kind of divide and dichotomy between the feminist movement. But at that point, past that, I think it becomes, like, more of a personal issue.
Yeah, exactly.
You can fight, like, I know my feminism comes from different reasons than Addison does, right?
Yeah.
And at that point it becomes a personal preference, but at the end of the day, we're all fighting for the same equality.
And I think a lot of the issue comes to when people are like, oh, this is a political movement, which it is in some respects, but you don't have to be liberal to be in it. You don't have to be Republican to be in it. You don't have to be pro-choice. You don't have to be pro-life. It's not at all a party issue. It's not just a political issue. It's just a societal norm issue, and we're trying to break down the barrier of that. And so when people say, oh, I'm not a liberal, oh, I'm not pro-choice, I can't be in this, that's not at all true. We accept everybody, and the fact that you want to make a difference is fantastic. And so we're not going to say, oh, you can't be part of this. I mean, assuming you're not racist or something.
Well, I think,
like, we're not going to turn people away for wanting to help.
Right. I think the pro-choice, pro-life argument can get a little messy there.
Yeah, I mean that's not what this is mainly about. Maybe there are subsections, but like the whole umbrella of feminism is not.
Yeah, but I think it's important to recognize that, like, as people, we can't push our beliefs. Right. And that's a lot of the reason why I'm pro-choice, is because personally I'm not religious, so and personally I'm very pro-choice, but I don't know if I'd ever have an abortion, and I hope I'm never in a position where I have to consider getting one, but I understand that there are women in this world that really do need them, and I think at that point that's a very feminist perspective to take, because we need to take a step back and recognize that our struggles are not the same as somebody else's. And my biggest issue with a pro-life argument is that, well, this is what I believe, so you need to believe this too, because this is what science says, or this is what the Bible says, and not everybody believes in those things. And that's kind of just how I personally view the subject itself.
Like, I don't want to get into this whole pro-choice, pro-life thing. This is just about feminism.
Well,
I'm not even going to say anything about it.
With that thing, there's obviously dichotomies, and it's drawn at party lines usually.
Yeah, but it doesn't have to be. It shouldn't have to be.
Obviously, but there's always that issue of, say someone gets into feminism and they believe, okay, this is what's right, and this is the good thing in my life.
Of course.
Obviously, anyone who, like, with that kind of thought process, people look at that and be like, that individual will look at what they believe and be like, okay, well, everyone else needs to believe this because this is what it's right. Yeah. So do you think that there's a dichotomy created there where anyone who doesn't believe in the ideals that are held up by those individuals are basically the opposite, and that's what creates, like, because obviously the idea of what even recently the whole term of being a Nazi has changed, like, basically been generalized to the point where it doesn't really have any meaning because it doesn't coincide with someone else's beliefs. So do you think that there should be a spectrum where people hold to these beliefs but not to extreme amounts, or to there's varying lengths between the two?
Well, my thing is that, like, if you don't believe the same thing I believe, I'm not going to tell you, like, oh, I hate you, like, you're the worst. I'm not going to say that you're wrong, because what you believe is what you believe. Just because it's not what I believe doesn't mean that it's not valid. And I think a lot of people come to issues with that, especially with the Women's March, are saying, like, oh, they're forcing their beliefs on me. All we're saying is that we need the right to choose what to believe. And, like, I'm not going to say that you're awful for not believing this, but I just want to understand why you don't believe in feminism. Like, tell me why people don't want women's equality. I truly do not understand why someone would be a feminist.
I feel like a lot of that issue comes from the fact that people believe that, like, because there's obviously egalitarianism, which is basically is equality of all people. Yeah. So they see the gender usage of the word and they're like, okay, there's something different. There has to be something different. And that, I guess that's what comes from the political movement versus the theology of egalitarianism. So
I think there's two things. For me, I'm just going to respectfully disagree with Addie. Yeah. I do think there are wrong beliefs, and I think we need to, at some point, I think we need to stray away this thing that you can believe whatever you want, because I don't think that, I'm just going to say, I think if you don't think that men and women should be equal, I think you're wrong. And
I think you're wrong, but, like, I'm not going to tell you you're wrong.
I think we should, though, because at that point, like, we're normalizing it. We're saying, okay, like, you think it's wrong, but I'm just going to let you live your life. I think
we need to blatantly tell them that they're wrong, though. We should try to educate them.
No, but I think at some point we do need to say you're wrong, because, like, let's take this out of context of, like, the woman-men issue, and put it in the context of, like, white supremacy. Like, if a white supremacist gets up there and they say, I think people who are white are 10 times better than people who are black, I don't think we should be like, explain to me why you think that.
Yeah, that's true.
I guess that's true. I think that's obvious, but I think the issue, the muddiness comes from, okay, but who's calling that person a white supremacist? Like, obviously there's
the person calls themselves a white supremacist.
Yeah, obviously there's, like, blatant beliefs that, like, oh, they're obviously a white supremacist, sure. But, like, and I don't feel like a lot of people are going to self-identify at that point because they understand how the weight of the word racism and sexism. So,
but if you understand the weight of it, then why do you believe those
well,
things?
that's the thing. I think the issue is that people perceive people's different views as simply as not aligning as their own, as it's different and it's not to the same extent as mine.
Yeah.
Sure, and I think like that becomes like a different argument because there's something different than actually saying the exact opposite. Like if someone gets up there and he's like, I think men are 10 times better than women, right? Like you're wrong,
that becomes
right?
an issue, obviously.
But like there's definitely, and I see this every day in the feminist movement and stuff. Like there's different. Like because we grew up in different societies and we grew up in different families, I think everybody thinks that like the feminist problem like of inequality is at different places than the others. I think we all have the same general idea, but it's definitely a range. And at that point, like there's nothing wrong with being in that range and knowing that there is like there is a difference between men and women, but this is what I think we are versus where Addie thinks we are. But I think that's different than like someone being like, well, I just think men are better. No.
Yeah,
like, you're wrong.
I agree with Tara on that.
Like,
you're right. I don't know if that's necessarily what I meant to say, but like, I don't like telling people that their beliefs aren't right, but at the same time, it's like, why don't you believe in this? Like, why don't you believe in feminism?
I think that's something really important to bring up is that we've kind of been raised to like in a society where like we can't respect everybody's opinion, which is a really great like idea, but my thing is you need to show me why I should respect your opinion. Like you can't just tell me. I feel like you shouldn't
even respect everyone's opinion because obviously there's obviously going to be opinions you can't simply respect.
Right.
But
Exactly.
I think the issue is that respect is being tossed around like it's tolerance.
Yeah.
It's being used in the same context.
Yeah,
so.
that's a really good point, that respect is not necessarily tolerance.
Like, prove to me why I should respect your opinion, because I'm not going to respect your opinion.
Exactly.
All right.
I want to respect your opinion if you would respect mine, but at the same time, it's like, you're wrong.
All right. Well, thank you guys for coming.
Thank you very
No
much.
problem.